Hello and welcome to the July 17th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway here with Romeo Kukretsky.
Hey, folks.
Well, we told you that scheduling episodes would be difficult, and this is like the fourth time we've tried to record, I think.
Yeah, we're not having the best of luck.
But we're doing it, but part of that is that we had our Q&A episode and some unfortunate large gap of time since then. So since our last news update, we've had a lot of news items. We've actually had to bump some of them to next week that are a bit less time sensitive. But what are we talking about this week? Well, the main question, our headliner topic, is of course the massive missile attack on Kiev and several other cities throughout Ukraine on July 8th. Romeo and I were on the scene of the Children's Hospital. We'll be talking about that again as our headliner. Again, our combat update, there have been several very notable changes, especially in the New York front. There was a rather important prisoner release of some hostages that had been taken years ago, before the start of the full-scale invasion even. The massive terrorist attack in Dagestan on June 23rd. It feels like a bit too much time has gone over that since we've given a news podcast, but there's still lots of very important points that I feel need to be covered. Prime Minister of Hungary, Orban, has not been behaving himself very well lately. And then there were some key elections in both the United Kingdom and France. But before we get into that, I think we do need to talk a little bit about, well, the bread and butter of any news, and that is the weather. Unfortunately, there has been a very serious heat wave in Ukraine. As of today, the temperatures are reaching 38 degrees Celsius, or even hotter in some places. That's getting near to or even above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in America units. And normally, it's hot in the summer. You can't make that big of a deal out of it, but keep this in mind. Right now, Ukraine does not have a lot of electricity. If you do not have electricity, you cannot even run a fan. Throughout many summers in Europe, there will always be reports of excessive deaths from heat waves, from various medical conditions that are exacerbated by the extreme heat. And that is when you have the ability to turn a fan on. We can't do that right now. I'm sitting here, relatively healthy, young-ish man, and it's rough for me. Imagining the temperature's effect on the elderly and the infirm. There's something called excess deaths. So, especially when it's hard to tell the exact cause of death from anything, but you can kind of trace out where the extra stressors are, we'll be able to say that a certain number of people died that would not have died under the baseline circumstances. We will not know that number until the end of the summer, but I do believe that we will be seeing a lot of excess death from the various stressors from the heat right now. Part of that also even just has to do with food. I was just in the grocery store a couple hours ago, and the generator blew out of the grocery store, which means there is no refrigeration for the meat, which means that maybe some of that meat did not exactly stay 100% okay. In some grocery stores, that will be taken care of a lot more closely, and others that won't be. In refrigerators at home, food will be stored most of the time at my place anyway. The power's not out long enough for that to be too much of an issue. But where it is, excessive food spoilage, and there's another stressor. So heat, it's weird to talk about as this huge major problem, but it is. It very, very much is.
Ukraine is not the kind of country that people are used to this kind of heat. And combined with the fact that you don't have power to run AC or a fan, it's really difficult, honestly, to even go outside or move in the spans of when there is power and you're sitting under a fan. You're still sweating because it's still way too hot. it's too much. And the food spoilage thing is really a widespread issue. Multiple of my friends and acquaintances have complained that they've lost everything in their fridge, because while normally you will only lose power to 2 to 4 hours, sometimes you will lose power for 6+ hours. And if that happens in succession rapidly, and your fridge doesn't have enough time to cool down, if you, for example, only have power for 2 hours and 4 to 6 without, well, the fridge is just going to defrost and everything you have stored there is just going to spoil. It's really hard, I think, to overstate how big of a problem this is. Luckily, by the time this episode comes out, the heat wave should be abating according to forecasts. Temperatures should drop from 38, 36 to around 30, which is obviously much tolerable. I have forgotten what those are in freedom units, so have fun plugging that into a converter yourselves. It's just too hot. I hate it. I am not a heat person. I am very much I would live in the Arctic if it was feasible person. So this has been a very miserable period of time for me.
Though, for the listeners who may not know Romeo, I will remind that he is actually Bengali, and this should be
half Bengali.
He's half Bengali. It should be in your genes to.
Nope. Other half of my family is from Arkhangelsk Oblast in Russia. That is the northernmost oblast in European Russia. No, I am not a heat person.
Well, again, hopefully this will turn down soon, and hopefully the old people that sit outside of my apartment will not look like they are actively in the process of dying when I pass by. It's honestly kind of brutal to see. Anyway, but on to our headlining topic, which was the missile attack on July 8th. In terms of casualties, this was the largest attack on Kyiv since the beginning of the war. And not only Kyiv, throughout the country, but we'll get into some of the other locations later in the segment. We know that there were 38 missiles fired at Kyiv, with 30 of them being intercepted. These were of all makes and sizes, as well as several drones. This attack did seem to be much more successful than attacks in the past, and the methods that Russia is using for targeting are getting more advanced. So we do have to keep this in mind, that whatever air defense has been keeping Kyiv safe, more or less, since the Patriots showed up. The main target that at least made the news, though, was not the majority of the casualties. The casualties were spread out throughout the city, was the Untitled Children's Hospital. And before we get into the specifics of everything that happened on that day, let's point out what exactly this hospital is. It is the #1 children's hospital in the entire country. If your child anywhere in Ukraine contracts a serious illness, be it cancer or something else, this is the hospital that you really want them to go to. It's the Ukrainian equivalent of the Johns Hopkins Pediatric Center, or the Mayo Clinic or something like that. It is the famous hospital with the best equipment, with the best doctors, and is the #1. To oncohematology. In this attack was destroyed the only oncohematology laboratory in the country that is for testing for blood cancers. The one place. If you go to a lot of villages or cities throughout Ukraine, you'll often see some kind of poster or something raising money. The direct hit was scored on one of the smaller buildings within the complex, so that was thankfully able to minimize some of the damage and casualties that could have occurred. If the attack was directly on one of the taller high-rises that make up the hospital, it would have been much more devastating. But it did hit a smaller, about 3-4 story building, and the concussive blast from a cruise missile did cause significant amounts of damage to the surrounding buildings that did have to be evacuated. By the time that Romeo and I were able to get there, all the patients, thankfully, had been evacuated pretty quickly. every single ambulance in the city, it looked like, was making its way to the hospital to take the patients away to somewhere safer. You may have seen some of the pictures from the immediate aftermath of the strike of just a bunch of kids who were clearly undergoing chemotherapy to IVs with their nurses and parents waiting to be evacuated, but taken out of their ward. As of right now, a lot of the casualties have been fluctuating because after they had been evacuated because they had just sustained too much damage, and they're already, children with cancer. They're not like the most they're not the most what's the word for this? They're already not the most healthy people in the world that could survive severe trauma. So there have been several deaths since that day. I really feel like I need to point that out because...
Yeah, what's the big deal of, sending a cruise missile into a pediatric cancer hospital? I really can't stress this enough. It is a pediatric cancer hospital. I really dislike the word terrorism. I dislike the concept. I have expounded at length about why I don't think it should really be used anywhere as often as it is. But there's no other word for this. Blowing up a pediatric cancer center is terrorism.
And specifically, the part of this hospital that was hit was the toxicology ward, where specifically dialysis takes place. And so think if you have anyone in your family who had to go through dialysis for one reason or another. I know that was one of the main causes that in high school, we raised money for and all that. Keep in mind that is who was affected in this strike, and not all of them survived, like I said. Several other doctors were also killed, at least 6, so that number may have gone up, and it may go up in the time between recording and release, and just like there might have gone up between research and recording. So what hit this hospital? We know that it was a KH-101 missile fired by Russia at this hospital. We know from video recordings that this missile was completely intact, meaning it was not intercepted. Often a lot of the damage done to Kiev and other places is done by missiles who are shot down, and the debris is what hits other buildings because of air defense being more or less successful, but debris has to go somewhere, and often it kills people. But we do know that in this case, it was directly fired at this hospital, was not intercepted by anything. We have the video of the fully intact missile hitting this building. It was deliberate. Some of the Russian disinformation that has come out otherwise say that it was in a Ukrainian air defense missile that actually hit the building. And again,
not to mention, anti-air missile has nowhere near the explosive power to cause the type of damage. There's just infinite holes with Russia's narrative, as there usually is, because they honestly don't really try that hard to, lie about the horrible things they do. So as Anthony said, by the time we'd gotten there, most of the immediate evacuations had been completed, though there were still rescuers on the scene. There was a call sent out by volunteers not long after the strike asking for supplies and for just hands to pull apart rubble, because there was no clear understanding of who may still be trapped under that rubble. In the immediate aftermath of the missile strike. So by the time we got there, people had gathered from across the city. They're almost, like Anthony said, almost every ambulance in the city seemed to have been there. People had organized water delivery, food delivery, diaper delivery, even medical aid supplies and so on, to assist in the kind of clearance and recovery efforts. And people were literally just setting up lines to haul out rubble by hand. You'd literally just have one guy haul out a piece of rubble and hand it down a line, and then rinse and repeat for hours and hours and hours. it was incredibly hard to see. Akhmadyet it's not just a pediatric cancer. I mean, already being a pediatric cancer hospital is something just obscene to imagine any kind of violence at. But Akhmadyet is like a symbol for all of Ukraine, that we have, at least this one place that cares and will try to save your kid. And I know people who have taken their children to Akhmadyet. I've seen stories shared by people who've been treated there. It really was a symbol of Ukraine. And to see it just in rubble, to see the broken windows, the collapsed buildings, to see the just horrific damage that had been done to the place was very difficult psychologically to handle. But Ukrainians pulled together, as they very often do. If there's one silver lining to be taken from the past 2.5 years of this horrible, insane war, it's that Ukrainians have gotten pretty good at mutual aid. And like I said, people started gathering en masse as we arrived. And this was already, I would say, 4 to 5 hours after the strike. People were still gathering. They were still going to Akhmadyet. They were still bringing supplies. They were going into nearby supermarkets and buying them out and taking them to the volunteers to distribute. And the law enforcement authorities on the scene were assisting in that. They weren't just blocking off the site, not allowing anyone to enter, which I imagine would not have gone down well. But they were to figure out where stuff should be stored, where stuff should be sent, what supplies were needed. That part was nice to see. I can't call it inspiring, because nothing's inspiring when you're standing next to the rubble of a fucking children's hospital. But it was something. It was at least a sign that Ukrainians hadn't lost their humanity. And it was, by the time we left, I think a few hours had passed. We weren't really keeping track of the time. We'd managed to, at first we were simply circling the site. Then we found a gate where there was one cop at the gate who didn't seem to care whether people went in or out. So we managed to get our way inside the compound, or the complex, I should say, and take a look around, and lots of rubble. There was one image that really, really stuck with me. We were waiting around the outside of the hospital, of a dump truck that was full of rubble from the damaged and destroyed buildings, and there was a children's horse toy, like one of those riding like plastic riding horses for kids, that was just piled on top of that. And that image just stuck with me, because it's one thing to disassociate and say, okay, it's a building, buildings get hit. Rubble isn't body parts. Rubble isn't people. But when I saw that, like, horse toy, it was impossible to ignore what this was the rubble of. This was the rubble of quite possibly our best hospital. And it's not clear what's going to happen to Akhmadyet now. They were fundraising and are still fundraising, and had managed to gather a lot of money, but you can't build hospitals overnight. You can't even build them in a few months. And the Akhmadyet complex is pretty large. There are at least, I would say, 5 buildings on that territory of significant size, not to mention the big high rise. So there's the thing that kept going through my mind as I was staring at this devastation was, what's going to happen now? Because we don't have the capability to build a new hospital, even if we get the money and the funding, where do you build it? The Russians, there's no guarantee the Russians won't hit it again. As we can see.
Well, because this hospital was targeted, even with the relatively low death count, I hate using that phrase, but overall, considering the number of people who were there, the number of people who died, which is like less than a dozen, it seems, is truly miraculous. But what are the larger ranging ideas? What are the side effects of this? And that is, if you are a family in Ukraine and God forbid you have to think about starting a family where the child may not have the best health, who may have one of several medical conditions that could be treated with a hospital like this, but without it, it's impossible. You can't really stay in Ukraine. If you're going to get the medical care that you need for your child to survive, it may be possible elsewhere in Ukraine, but it's also possible that you'll have to go to Poland, to Czechia, to Germany, to Britain. And overall, it puts a chilling effect just on people having families. And with the war in general, that's already something that people have to think very strongly about, obviously. And one of the Russian goals we have to keep in mind here is for there to be fewer Ukrainians, for Ukrainians to be demoralized, for Ukrainians to run away and therefore become seen as a burden where they go, as refugees are often, unfortunately, where perhaps the husband has to be left behind in Ukraine as the wife and the child will go elsewhere, and that is psychologically taxing. And to just overall degrade Ukrainian morale in that way, and specifically in a way that will reduce the number of Ukrainians having families in Ukraine, which, because of the size of this, it may seem a bit hyperbolic to state it this way, but I absolutely see this as part of the genocidal efforts of Russia.
I don't feel like it's hyperbolic at all. It's one of their explicit and stated goals is to make Ukraine unlivable. That is explicitly one of the war tactics that they have, one of the war goals that they have. And we can see that they're employing tactics to realize that by hitting the energy infrastructure, by hitting hospitals. They are proceeding on that route to make Ukraine at least less livable for the people who live here. And let me tell you, living in the heat without power, without air conditioning, without a fan is already very difficult. If you, on top of that, also have to worry about your child being hit by a Russian missile while they're at the doctors, I honestly, I have a hard time.
And I think one of the things that has haunted me since the beginning of the war is reports by some Russian soldiers while committing rapes, saying that they were very specifically saying that they wanted to make sure that Ukrainians couldn't have any more kids. And the violence of sexual assault was one way of doing that. And again, attacking the place that keeps children alive is the same idea. But what are some other places in Ukraine, in Kyiv and the rest of the country that were hit? One of them was quite close to where I live, right next to my metro stop. And that was the Asida Clinic. This is, much like the hospital we just talked about, this is a clinic that is mostly for women experiencing difficult pregnancies. If there's some kind of complication, go through some course of treatment to, a whole range of why that could be. Go there for one therapy or another to get them to pregnancy and have a healthy baby. This clinic was, much like the hospital, one of the best in the country for that specific purpose. I've been hearing from reports of other women who have gone to this clinic because they had one complication or another, and the treatments were able to make sure that, again, have a healthy family. So tied in with everything we just said about the hospital, apply it to this clinic as well. We know that 7 people died in that attack. On the way home from the hospital, I stopped by this clinic. The damage is not as extensive. This was due, there was an interception that, how do I say this? The damage to this building was not as extensive because it was the result of debris rather than a direct hit by a cruise missile. But it did destroy the top 2 stories of this building. It's about a 4 or 5 story building, I think it was. And it's right next to a whole bunch of other medical clinics. So the way a lot of medical clinics work in Ukraine is that they are basically clustered together for one reason or another. I'm not entirely sure why, but basically that whole neighborhood, again, 7 dead there. Elsewhere in the city, we know of an apartment and an office building in the Solomansky district, multiple buildings in the Holosivsky district, an apartment, Shevchenkivsky district. Many of these other locations did have casualties, although I did not go to them like I did go to the hospital and the clinic. On that day, we know that over 30 people died, at least 33, though again, the numbers are all kind of mixed in together whenever I try to hunt them down, and 117 injured. Just visually, though, of the number of strikes that took place, you can find pictures and video on the internet of this, but as I've gone over on this podcast before, my apartment does overlook the western side of the city. So I was woken up by the alarms and looked out the window to just explosion after explosion, fires for several hours as the alert was ongoing. I'll include pictures of this, links to some fundraisers in the Patreon page to give an idea of this, but it looked really, really bad that morning. Also, we're in the country outside of Kiev. We had the city of Dnipro. A high-rise was hit, killing 1 person and injuring 11. In Kryvyi Rih, the administration building of a coal mining company was hit, killing 11 people and injuring 47 people. This, as well as many places along the front line, where overall throughout the country within there were over 7 people killed and 189 injured. Again, one of the big...
I mean, quite frankly, what this shows is that the West is, specifically the United States, but this can be applied to European countries as well. They are simply not all that invested in defending Ukraine. Let's be honest. When you do not provide the appropriate amount of air defense, when you restrict Ukrainian capabilities to strike air bases from which these strikes are launched, you simply are saying that you are that some amount of Ukrainian deaths are politically acceptable to you. The problem is you don't get to choose, whereas in a domestic policy, when a politician passes some obviously evil law that is going to kill people, they can kind of choose who they kill. They write the law. However, these politicians are letting Russia choose who they kill. And in this particular case, they chose kids. The fact that more people weren't killed, that more kids weren't killed, is, like Anthony said, a miracle. There is no real reason why there are only 6 or 8 or however many deaths from the dozens or 40 or 50 or 100. The building, the hospital complex at the time, was housing over 600 patients, God knows doctors and nurses and janitorial staff and maintenance staff and admin and so on and so forth, and visitors. God, again, simply a miracle. And if the miracle hadn't occurred, if it was casualty kind of situation, simply the Western government saying, we're okay with this. We are fine with all of these people dying. We need more air defense. That's a simple fact. Any European country that's sitting on a Patriot system or the SAMP systems or whatever other AA systems that they might have, and they're like, oh no, we can't give that away. That'll diminish our capabilities. Diminish them against who? The only possible adversary that NATO and Europe could face is Russia. That is the only possible adversary. You think the Chinese are going to be bombing Berlin? Like, come on. There is no other possible actor on the European continent who militarily threatens the grand majority of European countries aside from Russia. Oh, our military, we won't have enough jets and tanks and AA for ourselves. Who cares? Who cares? You're not fucking using them. You're never going to fucking use them. Send them to us. That is the only way that we can stop kids from fucking dying.
Some diplomatic responses to this. Several more Patriot systems were promised to Ukraine, though Patriot systems have been promised to Ukraine before and have been slow in coming. So that's not an immediate fix. More concerning, though, is that the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, made a statement in the immediate aftermath of these strikes saying that they would allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles anywhere in the Russian Federation for defensive purposes, that they would not be limiting where the strike could take place. Right now, which the thing that basically saved Kharkiv was the allowance that Ukraine could strike into the immediate border areas in the Russian Federation that those attacks were being launched from. But the places that we're talking about, the weapons that can be used within Russia, don't reach far enough to hit the air bases where these planes are launched from. This is a missile that was launched from a plane, by the way, just to clear that up. But Ukraine right now has very limited ability to hit those air bases. It has hit some of them in the past, but with drones and other things of Ukrainian make that are not as good as using a Storm Shadow missile. If Ukraine can blow up these air bases containing these bombers using Storm Shadow missiles, then that will severely reduce the ability of Russia to strike at cancer hospitals.
Unfortunately, not long after PM Starmer made that announcement, the administration of Joe Biden stepped in to say that they are not expanding allowances for Ukraine for U.S.-made weapons, and there were reports that the White House was pressuring Downing Street to also walk back their own allowance. That is, the White House specifically stepped in the aftermath of a missile strike on a pediatric cancer hospital to restrict Ukraine's capabilities to defend itself.
The prospect of a Trump presidency is so much worse for Ukraine, but the current Biden administration really needs to get its head on straight about many things. Another thing that did come out afterwards, though, is that Ukrainian intelligence was able to secure the names of all the pilots and decision makers who took part in this strike. We know who pulled the trigger. We know who gave the order to pull the trigger. We know who was able to collate the intelligence needed to attack this hospital. We know their commanders, we know their decision makers. And well, Ukrainian intelligence will use that information in the future. We can leave it at that. But interestingly, this information came directly from a Russian pilot. A Russian pilot that for the last 2.5 years of this war has been taking part in bombing Ukraine. Something about this was too much for him. I can understand that. He might have been able to tell him all this time that he is taking part in a war to defend the Russian people or whatever, until his friend, who probably met his family, who probably met his children, he looked him in the eye and knew that that friend of his fired a missile at a children's cancer hospital. And that was too much.
Whatever this guy's motivations, obviously there's no way to know. And I don't put a high premium on his life expectancy. But he gave us the intel that we need to pursue some sort of accountability for this war crime. And at least for that, we're grateful.
But moving on now to our combat update, and like I've said, there's been several changes along the front lines. We have both good and bad news. So what can we say is positive here? So in the Kharkiv direction, again, the Russians have been pushed back in the city of Vovchansk across several blocks. Just within these last few days, there's been a serious fallback of Russian forces. They continue to hold on to that factory that we talked about in our last news update while being supplied with drones, with drone drops, but that can only continue for so long. At one point, the Russians were able to also seize the village of Sotnitsky Kozachok, which is in the Kharkiv Oblast. It's a village that is literally directly on the border. It is straddling the border with Russia, and the Russians were able to seize this village and have already been driven out. As of recording, they did this yesterday. So in the Kharkiv direction, the assault on the oblast by Russia has not only stalled out, it's stalled out relatively quickly and is now being pretty consistently being driven back. As we've talked about in the past, there was a concern that the assault would go into the Sumy direction afterwards, and not only did that not happen, it seems as though some of the indicators that it would have since dissolved. Or some of the bad places that have gone on, and that is in the New York Toretsk region. This is the part of the Donbass front line that has not moved at all, actually, throughout the course of the full-scale invasion. It is the area, anyway, to the immediate east of New York, and Toretsk is the exact same front line that it had been since 2015, and that is a very notable thing to point out. However, the Russians are attacking New York from the south and broke through the Ukrainian defenses in that direction and have seized most of the southern portion of this village. New York, think of it as kind of T-shaped in a way, or cross-shaped, of a center with residential areas extending out eastward and then southward. It's not perfectly radial or anything like that. The southern portion has largely been captured by Russia, where they are now butting up against a canal. As is always the case, it is hard to cross water, and for the last couple of days, their offensive in New York has stalled out. However, their advances against Toretsk are also threatening to encircle the eastern portion of New York, or at least put it in a cauldron, which will make defending that area much more costly. So there may be a pullout of eastern New York at some point in the near future. And I think I'll talk a bit more about New York in next episode, possibly, but we don't have a massive amount of time to deal with that. The other area that has evolved has been Chasiv Yar. The eastern section of Chasiv Yar, known as the Canal District. It is to the eastern side of this canal that we keep talking about whenever we talk about Chasiv Yar. The Russians have fully captured the Canal District, which means they control more or less the entirety of the eastern shore of this canal that is protecting the town of Chasiv Yar. The area south of Chasiv Yar, such as Klashivka, has been able to repulse Russian attacks, and there's not been much change to the area to the south of Chasiv Yar because of that. For our next topic, it's much more of an upbeat one, I think, and that has to do with a prisoner release that took place on June 28th. This is immediately after another prisoner release that freed 90 soldiers from Russian captivity. But this prisoner release stood out in that it had some rather important civilians who had been captured by Russia. The first of these is Nariman Zhelyal. He is the deputy chairman of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. It is the Congress for Crimean Tatars in Ukraine, including in the occupied Crimean Peninsula. And he had actually lived on the occupied Crimean Peninsula during the occupation, which is very, very dangerous for a Crimean Tatar activist to do. In 2021, he left to take part in the Crimea Platform, which we've talked about this numerous times because I am a big fan of Crimea Platform. It was a conference to decide on have some kind of diplomatic answer to taking the Crimean Peninsula back. This was before the full-scale invasion, and how to promote the cause of the Crimean Tatar people through education and that media, that sort of thing. So he left to take part in this conference, and upon his return to Crimea, he was arrested on charges of being accused of blowing up a pipeline which were obviously complete nonsense. But he has spent that time since 2021 in Russian prison. Up until now, he is now free. Among them were also 2 Catholic priests from the occupied territories who were arrested for anti-Russian activities or whatever the case may be. Being a Catholic in the occupied territories is not very good. We talked about this a bit when we talked about the issue of Protestants in the occupied territories, but it's not that much better for the Catholics because Ukrainian Catholic Church is considered completely tied to the Ukrainian state and therefore hostile to Russia. There was also Valery Matyushenko, who was arrested in 2017 in the occupied territories of the quote-unquote Donetsk People's Republic due to his pro-Ukrainian views. He was just straight up black-bagged one day and had been in prison and tortured ever since, and he is now free. There's also Elena Pia, who was working at the Horliv Art Museum, again, occupied the Donetsk region before the full-scale invasion. She had actually left to free Ukrainian territory, but had returned to her town to care for her mother and was arrested again for her pro-Ukrainian position. So these are all people who were just civilians who the Russians captured because they did not like their opinions, and they have finally been released in some cases since 2017. So near the very beginning of this conflict. Some more good news in the vein of prisoners and such is that Gerasimov and Shoigu, they have both been added to ICC warrants for their targeting of civilian infrastructure and other war crimes. So as of right now, Putin, as well as Lvova Belova, who organized the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, they have ICC warrants out for their arrest. So now add Gerasimov and Shoigu to that list. And really, it should be the entire Russian government and command structure, but we get what we get. This next topic here, it goes to some of what we have said about the Caucasus region of Russia in the past. We had covered how near the beginning of the Israel-Gaza war, a group of people in Dagestan had stormed an airport. A plane had arrived from Israel, mostly people doing medical tourism, demanding to find any Jews. We had an episode about this. I believe we called it a Russian pogrom. Well, there has been another extremist attack in Dagestan, the region in the North Caucasus of the Russian Federation, on June 23rd. There was a highly coordinated, I really had to point this out, this was a highly coordinated attack that took place in the cities of Derbent and Makhachkala, the 2 main cities in the region. And in both of these cities, gunmen targeted both the church and a synagogue. In Derbent, it was the Church of the Intercession and the Kali Namaz Synagogue. In Makhachkala, it was the Cathedral of the Assumption, as well as the local synagogue there. In these attacks, 27 people were killed and 45 were injured, including 5 of the gunmen. Most of the deaths that occurred on the Russian side were police officers who were fighting against the gunmen. And a bit later on in the day, in the village of Skirokala, there was a shooting there as well that killed several police officers. No specific group claimed this attack, but the Islamic State Khorasan province congratulated their comrades in the Caucasus over this, so we can kind of assume that this is the so-called Islamic State Caucasus region. If we look at some of the recent attacks, we see a pattern of increased Islamic terror attacks in Russia. Again, we look at the October 2023 airport incident that we just talked about. In March of this year, there was the Crocus Hall, where the Islamic State Khorasan assaulted a concert venue in Moscow. But after both of these incidents, and this will play into what we'll get into either, no one was really punished. In the airport incident, people were only given administrative fines, just pay a fine for doing this. And in the case of the Crocus Hall terror attack, the Russians claimed to capture people, but for reasons that we went over in the episode where we talked about this, I think it's pretty clear they did not capture the actual people involved. They just found some random Muslim guys, tortured them, and accused them of being the shooters. And even in this case, the response to it, which is what we'll talk about now, does not seem like it's going to help their cause very much. So the people who took part in this shooting are very interesting. Most of them were in some way related to or otherwise connected to a Russian politician named Magomed Omarov, who is the head of the Sergokalinsky district of Dagestan and a member of the United Russia Party. 2 of his sons and 2 of his nephews, as well as several of their co-workers, were involved in this. So the idea in Russia is that the people who take part in Islamist terror attacks tend to be lower class, lowly educated, not very engaged with the community or whatever the case may be. In this case, no. The people who did this shooting were very heavily tied into the power structures within Dagestan. One of the people, Gadzimurad Kagirov, was a mixed martial arts fighter. And he was a fighter at Eagle Mixed Martial Arts, which is run by the very famous Habib Nurmagomedov. If you know one Dagestani and you are otherwise not super interested in the region, you probably know Habib. He is a champion mixed martial arts fighter, very talented, very successful in the sport. And in Dagestan, being a fighter, being a wrestler, by being a mixed martial artist, that is considered a very high social standing within the country. Dagestan loves mixed martial arts. However, part of the key to this here is by looking at Habib. And I'm not the only person who has looked at it from this angle. The Russian security services are absolutely looking at it from this angle. If you look at Habib, he doesn't really identify as Russian. He does not wave the Russian flag around. And Russians have made a point in this in the past that Habib, someone ostensibly a citizen of the Russian Federation, does not really talk about being Russian very often. Many mixed martial artists from Dagestan have said very little about the Russo-Ukraine war. They have been much more interested in, for example, the Israel-Gaza war. These are people who are much more connected to their Muslim identity to any kind of Russian identity. And again, looking at Habib, he is a citizen of the United Arab Emirates. And this is just an idea I've been kind of tossing around, but historically, the idea of being Russian has been because it ties you in some way to the ability to make money, the ability to be respected, is you have to speak Russian language, take part in Russian culture, absorb yourself into the Russian imperial identity to be taken seriously and have access to wealth and resources. Well, if you're a Muslim guy, even in a place like Dagestan, do you really have to look at Moscow to be the place of, wealth and culture and all that? No, you can look at Dubai. All the Russians go to Dubai. The Russians prefer Dubai than to Moscow. So there is this alternate identity that they can latch onto of being Muslim, and to identify yourself so strongly with Islam does not mean having to even give up any of the creature comforts that might have been asked to you in the past, of not being able to have full access to Moscow society and all that. That doesn't matter so much anymore. So I'm not accusing Dubai of being a hotbed of Islamic terror or anything like that, though I have quite a bit of problems with Dubai, but just in the idea of a lot of the youths of Dagestan do not especially care about being Russian. And in this case, very, very connected people are now fighting against Russia. And the issue of extensive conscription in the region has made people angry there as well, to drive people away from Russia even more. There has been a very active opposition movement in Dagestan, both Islamist and non-Islamist, to the point where now, getting to the reaction to these shootings, we are now seeing a much stronger conflict between the authorities in Dagestan and the Russian security state. The Russian security state, since the time of the shooting, has been straight up purging a lot of the Dagestani local government. They raided Habib's gym, suspecting that more people there may be involved in terrorist activities or Islamist ideology. And it's creating a real boiling point there. And they're being much less careful than they were in the past of treating Dagestani and Muslim identity as the enemy. We have seen this from a lot of, the mill bloggers saying the Dagestanis are not really Russian. We should, put the boot down on them. We have seen, again, these purges of the local government. We have seen the head of the Dagestani government appointed by Putin being extremely hostile to the culture of the region. And time again, we have been saying how this conflict in between the Caucasus and the rest of the country can only get larger, and how the lack of security forces resources can be put towards that because, all the spies and torturers and everything are currently torturing Ukrainians. This hotspot will only grow larger and larger. We talked about it during the Q&A session, even, where if there is any kind of internal civil war in Russia, it will be over the North Caucasus. And this seems like it's another piece of that puzzle. And we'll always be taking very close attention to that region and what may happen. Our next segment now, going from something a bit more grim to something just kind of curious. So the Ukrainian ascension process into the European Union has begun. The accession talks officially have started. We talked on a previous episode about how they're about to start. Well, now they've fully started. And it mostly seems to be going smoothly. We do know that this will be a years-long process, so anything that happens now is not that important. But still, we have to look at some of the additional demands put on Ukraine by Hungary. Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, has taken up the post as the presidency of the European Union. This is not a very important position. It's more symbolic than anything. It rotates between countries, and it just so happened to be their turn. People tried to not have it be their turn because they know that Hungary is the problem child of the EU, but it ended in that spot. Now, most countries, when they take up the EU presidency, they don't really do that much with it. They all recognize that this is a symbolic thing. But for whatever reason, Orban decided that now is his time to shine. He is now the leader of Europe and can start making demands of everyone. And to begin just one part of this, with the EU accession talks, Hungary put down a list of 11 demands on Ukraine in order to mostly reform how the Hungarian ethnic minority in the country is treated. In most cases, these demands can be accommodated. More authority given to local Hungarian ethnic communities, more autonomy given to their school system, that kind of thing. However, overall, the way he decided to word it is to basically turn the Zakarpattia region of Ukraine into like an autonomous republic for the Hungarian minority, which is simply not going to happen. A lot of this, like I said, very start of the EU accession talks process, don't take them too seriously right now. And we do know that for a lot of these points, the Hungarian and Ukrainian governments have reached some kind of negotiated settlement with them in the past and can work so on the future, with one exception. One very important exception, which is that Hungary wants Ukraine to declare Zakarpattia region to be historic Hungarian territory. Now, as Ukraine is fighting off a war against Russia because Russia considers parts of Ukraine to be historic Russian territory, you can see why the Ukrainians are not exactly thrilled about that kind of demand. There can be some kind of increased autonomy for some of the towns there. There can be all kinds of concessions that can be given. These are often done informally and actually outside of the public eye. A lot of the Romanian communities, for example, just negotiated settlements on their own without really dragging the EU into it. But Hungarians are just trying to make a fuss right now. And this issue of declaring it historical Hungarian territory is not a thing that anyone will take very positive. Beyond these demands, Orban decided to make himself an international diplomat as well. He came to Kiev and basically demanded of Zelensky that Ukraine reach a ceasefire agreement with Russia. Again, we're not going to really get too much into why that's stupid. I actually plan to do some kind of explanation of diplomatic processes, but let it be known that nobody is very interested in a ceasefire because everyone sees a ceasefire as just an ability for Russia to rearm, reorganize, and attack again. But he came to Kiev with those demands, and then immediately afterwards went to Russia. Again, presented himself as the lone voice of European diplomacy. And then, immediately after leaving Moscow, he met with former President Trump, leading to some kind of idea that he's being used as an intermediary between the Trump campaign and Russia. And well, that's not exactly a big stretch to us. However, as Orban is doing all this and having absolutely not a single person listen to him or consider him serious in any single way, we had another Hungarian political figure come to Ukraine, and that is Peter Magyar, the leader of the opposition. And I think we do have to point out his last name is Magyar, and I find that funny because Magyar means Hungarian. His name is Peter Hungarian, and he's a Hungarian named Hungarian, and that's amusing. But anyway, Peter Magyar has organized much of the Hungarian opposition behind him. This is a cross-ideological kind of thing between conservatives, liberals, and even leftists have all decided to get together because they all hate Orban. Hopefully, in future elections, they can take more power and put us all out of our misery regarding this terrible man.
Meanwhile, the UK and France did go to the polls. Again, we're reporting this quite late, so I'm sure the majority of our listeners probably know. But in the UK, the Labour Party overwhelmingly wiped out the Tories, that is the Conservative Party, in a great number of seats. They really, the Tories were kind of, what's the polite term for it? Rat fucked, I guess, would be the proper word. Mostly due to their own incompetence. They had like 5 or 6 prime ministers in the span of as many or fewer years. They mismanaged Brexit. I mean, there was no real way to properly manage Brexit, but they did quite literally the worst possible thing in every decision. And it seemed the UK were sick of them. Now the Labour Party under the premiership of Keir Starmer are in power. They've already been implementing a ton of policies. Unfortunately, they are still keeping some Tory artifacts, such as the anti-trans initiatives that the Tories started in the NHS. But overall, it's somewhat of a positive change. On Ukraine, Keir Starmer immediately came out and said that he has no intention of lessening support to Ukraine. He reiterated how important supporting Ukraine is for the UK's national security, and the new defense minister has already visited Odessa. On top of that, Starmer has promised a continual £3 billion a year in financial aid to Ukraine, on top of all the weapons they're sending. So despite the change of government in the UK, it seems their support for Ukraine has not gone anywhere. Meanwhile, in France, just to, for listeners, in the notes here, mind you, this is the 4th time we've attempted to record this episode, and we'd tried to do this over a week ago, I think was the first time we tried to get this episode done. And Anthony in our notes here has, please, for the love of God, form a popular front. Well, between writing those notes down and the French elections, they did form a popular front. The French President Emmanuel Macron called for an early election. Many, if not most commentators claimed that this was a horrible idea, that the Front National, or they've rebranded to the RN now, the far-right kind of Vichy party, was leading in all the polls. But it turns out there are less collaborationists in France than the RN and the far right would like. And there was a united front between the centrists and the left and liberal parties in order to make sure that the RN stayed out of power. While the French left isn't the most pro-Ukrainian, they have been making more pro-Ukrainian statements. And of course, Macron, who has remained prime minister, has no intention of dialing back his support of Ukraine or his increasingly public and obvious disdain for Russia and Putin personally. So on those fronts, at the very least, there are positive signs. It's kind of in the US's ball court now.
Yeah, we've had election results in many countries recently that have all turned out pretty well for the good guys. Please, America, don't be the outlier. In our last segment here, though, it's another diplomatic topic, which was the NATO summit on July 9th to 11th. There was a lot of messaging that went around about this. The Russians predictably freaked out. The missile attack on Kyiv was designed to be the immediate day before this summit took place in order to scare Europe. Overall, though, not much happened, did it? There was a lot of statements from even the Ukrainian diplomatic corps saying that we have taken another step to joining NATO, and could, technically be the case in the
narrator's note. It is not.
In the most abstract bureaucratic
way.
way.
Still isn't.
Okay.
Still is not in the most abstract bureaucratic way. I know this because 6 months prior to the full-scale invasion, I released an article on Zaborona called Ukraine's Broken Road to NATO, where I kind of recapped the history of Ukraine's broken road to NATO up until that point. I noted repeatedly and explicitly that there is only one sign and only one thing that will truly mean or will truly lead to NATO integration, and that is the provision of a membership action plan. That membership action plan has been asked for by Ukraine for a number of years now. It has not been offered, and there are no signs on the horizon that it will ever be offered. So when it comes to all these summits, the usual reality of these things are it's a great vacation, working vacation for a bunch of bureaucrats to slum around in a nice hotel and chat with their colleagues and little else.
Yeah, like part of this was also because there were so many other summits in literally the weeks leading up to it. They really couldn't squeeze anything too interesting in there either. The various promises of weapons deliveries and that kind of thing had already happened between, well, I mean, look to our last news episode of the 4 separate summits that had taken place within the previous month, but there was really nothing more to say here. So they didn't have any kind of PR pushes they could use. They had already used them all. They had kind of squeezed that lemon as hard as they could. So there wasn't anything interesting to say at this summit. One interesting thing that we could say about it is that it really kicked the Russian propaganda into overdrive. We had Medvedev going even crazier than usual, former president of Russia, currently some security official. He was going on about how there could be, if Ukraine joins NATO, there would be neither a NATO nor Ukraine or something like that. They, for whatever reason, they saw this conference as a serious threat that they needed to prepare a lot of propaganda talking points for, even though it all turned into ultimately a wet fart and was never going to be anything other than a wet fart. But that rounds off our episode for this week. With the amount of time that went into this episode, I basically have half the next episode written already. Actually, we'll be talking about the Republican National Conference, which is ongoing as we're recording right now. I'm sure there'll be some information that comes out of that that will be relevant to Ukraine in one way or another. Yes, we are familiar with the fact that Donald Trump was shot at, but that's not really our topic, so we don't have to talk about that, thank God. But until that time, and I'm busy writing everything now, if you'd like to support Ukraine more broadly, go to our link tree for the list of resources and news outlets. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype, the podcast here, the best thing you can do is to like us, subscribe to us, tell your friends about us, get more people listening. If you'd like to support us financially, you can go to our Patreon at patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. More Patreon content is planned in the future, and you'll have access to our Discord, which, like with our questions and answers episode, we will interact and have another questions and answers episode in the future because we quite enjoyed that. But thank you all very much to our supporters. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerland, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kukretskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Perrone, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, PLM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Aiden, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Bavona, Evelyn Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Poem, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jared, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Lori Halila, Lemonican, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokaryuk, Stuart Akers, Siddle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Veronica, Victoria Leontoneva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much for your support. You are what make this all possible. Until next week, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!